According to r/MMORPG, the 18 YouTube videos that have been made on the subject, and probably the majority of people viewing this video, the MMORPG genre is dying. I wanted to look at this from a contrarian perspective and try to use as much quantifiable evidence as possible to see whether that is actually the case. Now, finding player numbers for a lot of MMOs these days is very hard. It used to not be all that hard as developers would release these numbers in the past. From the late 90s until the peak of WoW in 2010, I don't think anyone would deny the MMO genre saw massive growth. And it's easy to prove that because back then developers gave subscriber numbers. Now we don't have that for a lot of MMOs, so we are left with estimates for at least some of them. But there are a few MMOs that do release numbers. I will certainly not be using the MMO populations website as that data is incredibly flawed and based on social media activity only. For example, it says Ashes of Creation is the 25th most played MMO with 3 million active players. So we're not going to be using that or any of the other similar websites. These are the estimates I made for the top 12 MMOs in the West currently. These numbers come from a combination of Lazy Peon's video where he talked about the most played MMOs, where he did some estimates, and then my own estimates and calculations added to that as well. I will link a video where I talk more about these numbers and how I came up with them. In total, there are close to 10 million active players of MMOs in the West. This alone doesn't suggest to me that the genre is dead, especially when you consider these are primarily PC MMOs, and this does not even include the much bigger mobile market. But of course, not already dead does not mean the genre is not dying. So we're going to have to look at a lot more information. Luckily, there are a surprising amount of highly accurate player counts for some of the most played MMOs in the West, but it does take some digging to find some of this data. The MMOs that have really accurate player data are Final Fantasy XIV, RuneScape and RuneScape 3, Lost Ark, Albion Online, EVE Online, and New World. In most of these cases, it is because the developers actually put out concurrent player information, and players have collected it. Or they are Steam exclusive games, which Steam does put out concurrent player numbers, and then I just had to convert it to active, which is a little bit of an estimate. I will have all the links to all my sources in my Discord if you're curious. For all of these, I do convert concurrent numbers to active players by multiplying concurrent by 3.5. I came to this multiplier by looking at some of the data for New World sales figures and concurrent numbers at its launch to determine roughly how concurrent translates to active players per month. But again, it's a very rough approximation, so do keep that in mind. For the rest of the MMOs on this list, I had to do a bit more estimates in terms of the numbers. Those MMOs were BDO, ESO, Guild Wars 2, and SWTOR. I found as many estimates as I could find and used the ones that made the most sense to me. All in all, I do think this is the most accurate list of MMO player activity out there, even though I had to do a healthy amount of estimation throughout this video. So for the first MMO, we of course need to look at World of Warcraft. Now, Blizzard used to release subscriber numbers for WoW until the numbers started to decline. Now we have our estimates. Most estimates suggest WoW's player numbers continue to decline. Using these estimates, this is roughly what I think the situation looks like for WoW's subscriber numbers, which still puts it as the most played MMO in the West. So far, this isn't a great start to try to find evidence that the genre is not dying. But let's keep looking at the rest of the MMOs on this list. Luckily, Final Fantasy does have great history of its total active monthly players. This information comes from a Japanese blogger called Lucky Bancho, and it does show the active players for each month. So I do not have to do any conversions for this concurrent player number. With this, we get our first win. Final Fantasy XIV is indeed not only not dying, but it is growing and very solidly in second place of the most played MMOs in the West. In my opinion, the third most played MMO in the West is likely Black Desert Online. This is based on things like Steam charts, even though Steam charts is not the exclusive platform for BDO. There were a few estimates I could find out there that looked somewhat trustworthy to me, and Lazy Peon's most played MMOs video again was another source. However, I did have to do a fairly heavy amount of estimating as BDO does not put out player numbers, and it is not a Steam exclusive, so Steam charts is not all of the players. That being said, the Steam charts for BDO are very steady. It's not growing, but it's not declining. So my guess is the total player numbers are fairly steady for this game as well. and I'm guessing that they've been holding steady around 500,000 active players for several years now. Again, this is not concurrent numbers, these are active monthly players. So far we have one MMO in clear decline, one that is clearly growing, and one that is active and steady with this player base. Then we have Albion Online. Albion has put out daily active player counts several times over the years. And again, we see an MMO with a very healthy current population and one that is currently growing. ESO is another one that I had to do some heavy estimations for. Its team charts have been pretty steady over the last several years with a very slight decline overall. So I think this is a fairly stable population, but it does have a small decline going on currently. RuneScape does put out player numbers on their website, and the Misplaced Items website has collected this data since 2013 and displays the historical data on their website for both old school RuneScape and RuneScape 3. This data shows that old school RuneScape has actually been growing, while RuneScape 3 is very steady in its population. For Lost Ark, this is a Steam exclusive, so I just had to take the data and convert it to active players by again multiplying by that 3.5 number I came up with. And yes, it did have a big bot problem at one time, so some of these numbers are skewed, but overall this one is in steep decline. For Guild Wars 2, again, I had to do some heavy estimates. But we do know that Guild Wars 2 revenue has been very steady, and their Steam charts are quite steady as well. So again, I think this is an MMO that's very stable in its player count. It's not growing, but it's also not declining. EVE Online does put out concurrent player numbers, and you can find the historical data at eve-offline.net. With this, we have an MMO that is fairly steady in its player numbers, with maybe a very slight decline over the last 5 years or so. Next, we have New World. As another Steam exclusive, we can get pretty reliable player data. And without question, this is an MMO in clear decline currently. Finally, we have Star Wars The Old Republic, which I again had to estimate pretty heavily on. The Steam charts are pretty steady for SWTOR, so I'm going to presume this MMO is fairly steady in its current population, though I believe the population is probably quite small for this one. So for the record, we have 3 MMOs in very clear declines with WoW, Lost Ark, and New World. Then we have 3 MMOs that are steady in their populations with BDO, RuneScape 3, and SWTOR. Then we have 3 MMOs that are growing when you look at Final Fantasy XIV, Albion Online, and Old School RuneScape. Then we have 2 MMOs that to me are just too close to call. They are either steady or in very slight decline. So irregardless, I would say that not every single MMO is dying right now, like some think. 2, we actually have some MMOs seeing very nice growth, and only 3 in clear decline, which I think is a good sign overall that the genre is not in nearly as bad of shape as some people think. So I decided to take the next step and combine all these numbers together to see what the total MMO population is across these 12 most played MMOs. And the output might shock some of you. The overall MMO population is fairly steady since 2017. So perhaps people are overly considering the WoW decline as a symbol that the entire genre is dying, when in fact it looks like the player base have just spread out a whole lot to a bunch of different MMOs. So all of these WoW killers, maybe they actually did kill WoW, but as a collective and not a single entity. That being said, it's still hard to argue that WoW is dead when it is still the most played MMO, at least in the West. But clearly it's moving in the wrong direction. But wait, there is more. Perhaps the MMO genre is not dying, but instead it is growing at a much slower rate than the rest of the gaming industry. Here is a chart of the growth of gaming revenue over time. The PC segment is growing at a slower rate than mobile, but faster than all other categories on this list. So perhaps the MMO genre is growing, but at a slower pace than the rest of the PC category. And certainly slower than mobile gaming is growing. And what about the future of the MMO genre? Well, we know there are over 40 MMOs on the horizon, many of which will fail, but there are still some that are very promising. It has been a long time since I've seen so many well-funded Western MMO projects on the horizon. And there are estimates for the future revenue growth of the MMO genre. Most of them do suggest the MMO genre is predicted to grow a substantial amount in the future. What do you guys think? Is the MMO genre dying? Or is it in an okay place? Not great, but not that bad. That's what I think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.